It was already obvious that we wouldn't make it to the top and back down before running out of oxygen and probably daylight. As we moved on across a narrow slabby ramp that turned the next pinnacle, Frank could see his controls slipping away. He was constantly forced to remove his mask and gasp in the thin, harsh air, and finally had to take the only option open to him and turn back, urging me to carry on without him. He stayed on to photograph me as I traversed on towards the foot of the 60-metre high crag that forms the second step, the most formidable barrier on the ridge and the gateway to the summit. He then turned to begin the slow, cautious descent. The words of Dawson Stelfox, quoted in Lorna Siggin's book Everest Calling, describing the moment he and Frank Nugent separated high up on the north ridge of Everest. How's it going, everybody, and welcome to the Why the Mountains podcast with me, your host, Stephen Farley. If you are a hill walker or mountaineer, or just someone with a love of stories of adventure in the mountains, this is the podcast for you. In this first series, we're exploring the history of Irish mountaineers on Everest, from the earliest pioneering days right up to the latest ascents. We will take you on a journey from the Irish contribution to the earliest years of alpinism and the exploration of the Himalayas and Mount Everest, through the breakthrough successes of the 90s, the heartbreak, the tragedy, the many failed attempts, the loss of mountaineers in their prime, and the latest iteration of Everest climbing through guided commercial ascents. Throughout the following episodes, we will explore what makes these mountaineers tick, how they found their way onto the hills and mountains first in Ireland, then further afield, before tackling the often deadly slopes of Everest. In this episode, we hear from Dawson Stelfox, leader of the Irish expedition to the north side of Everest in 1993. Sit back and enjoy, and if you like this episode and want to hear more, please like and subscribe to the podcast and spread the word amongst your friends, family, walking, trekking and climbing partners. There will be something for everyone in this series, and I hope you enjoy. Apologies for the sound quality in this recording, a combination of outside factors and inexperience, and all my fault. I began, of course, by asking Dawson, why the mountains?
Oh, that's a long story, Steve. I was introduced at a very early stage. My grandparents, in particular, lived down in Newcastle, down in the Mournes, and both of them are botanists by background. So from a very early age, I spent summer holidays down there and was introduced to the Mournes, not from the point of view of climbing mountains as such, but being out in nature, looking at the world, going for walks, going into the forests, learning from them. And I think that sort of sparked off an interest which kept me going, if you like, in terms of just being out in the natural environment. But it wasn't until I'd started going hill walking, going camping, doing Duke of Edinburgh's Award, things like that. I was in the Boys Brigade, which did a lot of camping in the Mournes at the time. So as a youngster, but it was about, I think I was 15 or 16 as I got an interest in rock climbing, and went on a course actually to start with down at Tullymore Mountain Centre. And that was my introduction to sort of technical climbing, if you like. And I just got the bug. I got it immediately, took to it, and felt at home in the mountains, and felt the idea of challenging yourself on a rock face was something which was really rewarding in terms of setting yourself a problem and then overcoming that. And met people on those courses, started climbing with them. And in fact, when I was at school, the last couple of years at school, I helped set up a mountaineering club in the school. And that sort of, again, sort of sparked off. So by the time I went to university, in Belfast, Queen's, where there was a very active mountaineering club. By the time I went to university, I was already climbing and ready I'm sure fixated, but absolutely dedicated to it. I mean, it was something that from late teens and the spare time I spent climbing.
It was obvious to Dawson from an early age that climbing is what he wanted to do, going so far as to set up a mountaineering club in school and exploring the north for the best locations.
The Mournes will always be very special because it's our local hills. And it's a fantastic place for hill walking as well as rock climbing. But there are 20, 30 different crags in the Mournes, lots of varieties of climbing. And so that would be I guess, the ultimate favourite place. But up here as well, we've got Fairhead up on the north coast, one of the premier cliffs up in Ireland for rock climbing. Again, from when I was sort of late teenager, I was starting to climb up there with friends, and that and Fairhead remains a very special place as well. And of course, Donegal, as slightly further afield, again, so much variety of climbing from the sea cliffs to the big mountains. It's one of the things in Ireland which is so special about climbing is there's such variety of climbing, such variety in geology, which in turn brings variety of climbing over relatively short, small areas. So it's a fantastic place to climb.
Dawson went to Queen's University Belfast at the right time, joining a flourishing mountaineering club that helped him take the next steps.
It was pretty crucial, really. I mean, I came into Queen's at a time when there was quite an active mountaineering club, and university clubs tend to go through phases of development and slackness, if you like, depending on who happens to be there at the time. And I was lucky and came into the club at the time when there were already good experienced climbers, lots of people who were doing long degrees, like my architecture degree. So we were there for many years. And that builds up. That sort of creates a critical mass of experience and then confidence to start going. My first trip to Scotland in wintertime was with Queen's Mountaineering Club. I was out in the Alps, and then out of it came an expedition to the Andes, as early as 1980, when I was just 22, I think. So that was quite ambitious, sort of exploratory mountaineering for the first time at quite a young age.
Dawson was only beginning his studies and his climbing career when he got his first opportunity to go overseas to gain some experience at serious altitude.
Well, I was lucky enough in 1977. I was lucky enough to be invited on an expedition to Iran, and that was so it was an expedition run by staff and instructors down at Tullymore and the Sports Council. But they deliberately were bringing on young climbers to go with them, so it was quite a big team. And there was a big variety of people on that. Some people were just going out for what would now be called trekking, but there were a lot of quite serious climbers in that as well. So my first introduction to, if you like, big mountains was the Alamku range in Iran. But that was, to a certain extent, that was a sort of guided expedition since because there were a lot of experienced people there. So the Peru expedition 1980 was first time when I was, if you like, out with just one or two friends on a big mountain doing all the decision making for myself. But the Iran expedition was an important lead up to that because it's this build up of experience over, many times going out and trying things, going out and failing. Very important part of mountaineering is not being able to do things, knowing when to turn back. And that experience builds up incrementally. But the Peru expedition was quite crucial from the point of view was we went out as quite a big team. We were all climbing as small groups of 2 and 3 people when it came to the mountains. So it was more like alpine style climbing in a big mountain environment. And that was a huge learning experience for us.
As is often the case with mountaineers from Ireland and the UK, it is the European Alps that is the proving ground, and Dawson was no different.
Yes, I mean, so I'd started going to the Alps. I went to the Alps in 1978 doing, as normal for the first time out there doing fairly easy, fairly standard things, building up experience. But it was through those trips to the Alps that we started meeting other climbers, in particular climbers from south, from the Dublin, from all over Ireland, met out there. And Ireland, mountaineering in Ireland has always been organised on an all-Ireland basis. The clubs are all-Ireland. Some of the clubs have northern southern members. The governing body is an all-Ireland body. But this was, in the middle of the Troubles, and there wasn't that much travel, north-south in terms of that. So meeting up with Irish climbers, a lot of it happened on crags in the mountains, Rupert Fairhead and Donegal. But going to the Alps was a crucial sort of melting pot for that. And that brought us, because of bigger pool of people, that brought me into contact with people with a lot more experience and a lot more ambition as well. And I suppose fairly soon we realised, I think we started trying to climb the six classic north face of the Alps in 1981, actually. Um, and that, I suppose, was a mixture of ambition and confidence building that we realised that we thought we could do these things. So it's myself, there's effectively four of us in that group. It was myself, Tommy McGuire, Ian Ray and Dermot Summers, started to try and climb all the six north faces of the Alps, which took me a bit longer. Dermot was actually the first person to climb them all. I climbed five of them over 1981, 1982, but the Eiger, the last one, it was 1988 before I climbed it with a New Zealand friend who was living here at the time. So in memory terms, the Matterhorn and the Eiger probably stand out as the two most significant ones. But on the Walker Spur, which I climbed with Ian Ray, we got hit by a massive thunderstorm, and that was a real struggle. I mean, we got had to bivouac on in that thunderstorm, big dump of snow and ice and stuff the next day. Had to climb out the upper section in bad weather with a lot of fresh snow on the rock. And that was the first really hard experience of fighting for survival, maybe, in terms of trying to get off a mountain where you've been hit by a storm. So that was a huge learning experience. And the Matterhorn, similarly, we had a difficult time on. But I suppose today, still the classic, most sort of memorable route of the 06 was the Eiger, the north face of the Eiger. I mean, it carries a special sort of character of its own, really, if it's all the history around that. And yet that time went relatively smoothly. I climbed it with a New Zealand friend, Andy McFarlane, over 2 days, 2 long days, but then a reasonably fast time for certainly Irish mountaineers doing that. And it's the route which probably has not diminished in seriousness or character over the years, because it's a whole mixture of things. It's technical rock climbing, there's ice climbing, there's a risk of stonefall on it. It's a very long route, very complicated route for finding your way up through the mountain, and there's always a risk of bad weather and things getting you caught there. It's very difficult to retreat from if you got stuck on it. So it's one of these routes which has kept its aura of difficulty over the years. So even today, anybody climbing the north face of the Eiger, it feels like a significant achievement to do, even though people have climbed it, sold it in a matter of hours now these days. It's still a daunting challenge for most climbers.
Dawson certainly proved he was capable, tackling and succeeding in climbing the classic six north faces in the Alps, Cima Grande de Lavaredo in the Italian Dolomites, Piz Badile on the Italian-Swiss border, the Petit Dru, part of the Mont Blanc Massif above Chamonix, the Grand Jurasse, again part of the Mont Blanc Massif but on the French-Italian border, the Matterhorn in Switzerland, and of course the Eiger. The six were first climbed by Gaston Rebuffa over the course of around 20 years from the 1930s to the 1950s. Dawson was proving his mettle.
Yeah, and all those things. The Intercessor Traverse obviously has this reputation of once you go across it, then that's it, you're committed to it. Retreat's very difficult. In reality, these days, retreat is possible because there's nearly always a fixed rope across it. So, but the story of Tony Kurt's on that dying, not able to retreat and be rescued. I mean, that story, and that's, I guess, the thing about the Eiger, the stories to go with it, and with many other mountains, are what shapes the character of it and provides both an incentive but also a sort of, barriers, confidence barriers to tackling these things, because they build up in your imagination as something, that psychologically you have to overcome as well as physically.
Unfortunately, tragedy is never far away in the high and difficult terrain that mountaineers operate in. And as Dawson was climbing the Walker Spur on the Grand Jurasse, drama was unfolding elsewhere that would have a profound effect on Dawson.
Well, coinciding with our fight on the on the Walker Spur. My girlfriend at the time was killed in the Alps. She was climbing with another person out on a mountain, um, and another climber fell from above and knocked her off, and she was killed. And that happened as I was on the Walker Spur in the storm, and then come back to Chamonix a few days later to discover that it happened. So that there was a period then when, that it was her death, Angela, her death. And then Tommy McGuire, one of our long-standing climbing partners, climbed the North Faces with on an expedition to India in 1981. Tommy fell and was killed on the descent off a route we'd just done a very fairly significant new first descent of the North Face of a mountain called Bhagirathi 3, Bhagirathi 2, and Tommy was killed. Not long before that, an Irish climber had been killed in Peru. There were some other friends who were killed at home. So there was a period then when there were a lot of good friends and were killed either at home or abroad climbing. And that was a real sort of dark period, really, because, all of these people have been climbed and died in the mountains doing exactly the same thing that I was doing, and yet they died, from a variety of reasons, bad weather, storms, freak accidents like Angela, somebody knocking her off, a whole combination of things. So there was a period then in the sort of, for a couple of years when my confidence was shaken, really. I mean, I was questioning, is this really what I wanted to be doing? But I never stopped climbing in that. I sort of climbed easy things for a while, still going out in the mountains, but I guess being a lot more cautious. But that was a fairly dark period in Irish climbing history. There was a lot of death and serious injury over that period. And maybe, looking back, you can say, well, maybe it's because people were pushing things a bit too hard, being too adventurous. But in fact, when you look at each one individually, there was different reasons for them all. But it is a recognition that, climbing is a dangerous activity. It still is. It's got a lot safer than it used to be. But you are deliberately putting yourself in danger and taking on risks. And by the decisions you make, trying to minimize those risks, obviously, and trying to control them, but all the time realizing that you're never in complete control, really.
When people die doing what they love in the mountains, to those on the outside looking in, it can be hard to see the justification for this loss. This is when there is a real need for people to rally around, and the climbing community, unfortunately, has a lot of experience in this.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, the sort of, companionship and support from the climbing community, especially, back to Angela's death and Tommy's death, which are the ones that affected me personally the most because they were both very close to me. Those things, you get through them with support from friends and family. And inevitably you question what you're doing. That's natural, I think. But there was, but that period in climbing, climbing has got a lot safer, broadly speaking. Partly through knowledge, partly through techniques and equipment, partly through knowing weather forecast being better, and knowledge being better just about what you're doing, availability of training courses. A whole variety of reasons mountaineering has got safer, but it can never be completely safe. Noel Hanna, as you mentioned there, hugely experienced, probably the most experienced high altitude mountaineer who's ever been in Ireland, and yet died probably from a medical condition high up on a mountain on the way down. So it wasn't a fall, it wasn't an accident. It was one of the many risks of climbing at high altitude in terms of the medical effect on your body, and that's a risk that Noel knew he was taking. Consciously was taking it, and in his mind the rewards justified that. For that for many years. But I've always thought it's important that you can never sanitize mountaineering completely. It's not that you can ever take all the risks away. The risks are part of the character of mountaineering. It's part of the challenge of it. So it's not, if it was ever it was never possible to take all the risks away. It would diminish the activity in the first place. And that's, I suppose, at the heart of the spirit of mountaineering is doing as much as you can with a particular set of decisions you make. So you make decisions about whether you're going to solo something, maybe with no ropes or whatever, or you make decisions about going with a big expedition with all the resources and backup and doctors and all the rest with you. And if you like, anything in between those is a decision that you make about the style that you're going to climb in. And that's part of the character and spirit of mountaineering. I mean, at the heart, what you're trying to do is more with less, really. I mean, that pure mountaineering is going out on your own, tackling a mountain just with, the bare minimum of equipment. But, that's maybe right for some circumstances, but in other circumstances, that's never going to work. You're never going to be able to get there. So you make decisions all the time about exactly what techniques, what tactics, what strategy to approach, who you're going to be with, what equipment you're going to use, what backup you have. All those things, they're the essence of mountaineering, really.
I really enjoyed listening to Dawson describe what he calls the essence of mountaineering, given the era he is referring to, a time when women and men challenged themselves against the mountains in the style of the time, and everything seemed so romantic. The Irish Everest expedition of 1983 came at what some might consider the close of that romantic era of mountaineering, before it became more commercial. I asked Dawson to describe what goes into putting together an expedition of that magnitude in the early 90s.
Well, difficult I have with the things is now looking back over a period of 30 odd years, and high altitude mountaineering is a very different game than it is now. We sort of got into the bigger mountains, the sort of high 7,000, 8,000 meter peaks at a time when it was. You could look back now, it was coming to the end of the amateur era in lots of ways. So up until that period, most expeditions had been national expeditions. So there were groups of people going out, mostly friends, but not always, going out. But certainly in the Irish case, friends coming together to go and climb. There were no commercial expeditions. Back then, there was no organisation behind it. You did everything yourself. You organised the transport, you were the guides, you did most of the work on the mountain. For financial reasons, and to certain extent, some deliberate decisions, you did the minimum amount of using porters and Sherpas. And it was very much an extension of our alpine climbing. We were trying to use the techniques, adapt the techniques for higher mountains. And we learned the hard way on lots of these things. The first 8,000 meter peak we tried was Manaslu in 1991. And we say the climbers of my generation, obviously there'd been earlier attempts at 7,000 meter peaks in Ireland, but this was the first 8,000 meter peak. And we sort of didn't know what we were doing in lots of ways because we had never tackled something of that scale before. So our aspiration was to do it as lightweight as possible in terms of adapting our alpine techniques, but at the same time acknowledging that we had no experience of the scale of big mountains. And that's what strikes you when you put yourself up against them. You just don't go up and down the day. You have to spend many weeks, months on these mountains, acclimatizing to them, putting in camps, trying to find your way up them. And the realization of the scale of what you're taking on really hit us home, honestly. And we learned so much. We had difficult times, mainly due to the weather, but also because within the group that we put together, there were very different ideas about how to try and climb the mountain. It's sort of an old story now, but we split up into different factions and different groups. Of the 11 of us that went out, we ended up with probably 3 distinct groups of people, all with different ideas about what to do. And that was exacerbated very clearly by the weather. We have atrocious weather. Really, it snowed and snowed and snowed. And there was a very high avalanche risk on the mountain. we were conscious and honestly had a lot of big accidents in the past with avalanches. So we had to be very cautious about when we went. And we really just got bogged down in the mountain. We didn't make very big progress. We didn't get much above 6,500 meters on an 8,000 meter mountain, so barely made a dent on it, really. But learned so much from that. We learned so much about how to survive in big mountains. Learned about team dynamics. Learned about the importance of a team that shares a view about how to do it. Because climbing really is about. It's not so much what you do, but how you do it is the crucial thing. The style, the tactics, talking about earlier. That's really what sort of binds a group of people together, either 2 people or 10 people together, is agreeing on the style and how you're going to approach the mountain, how you're going to tackle the mountain. And we learned that the hard way, honestly. But that's what set us up for a very cohesive team on Everest, really. But it was only, Everest sort of only came about quite late on. As I was climbing, out in the Himalayas, out in the Alps, out in the Andes, I'd never thought of Everest as a particular goal at all. It wasn't until really 1998, 1999, 1988, 89, that we started thinking about whether it was possible or not. And really only in 1990, when we put together the Manaslu expedition, that was, the idea of the 2 expeditions was coming in then, because we realised we didn't have the experience to go straight to Everest. We had to try something else first. But it wasn't as if I'd, as a teenager, thought I'm going to climb Everest one day. That really wasn't on the agenda. It was just climbing was on the agenda, and that led to Everest, but it wasn't a preordained goal at all.
Strangely enough, even though, as Dawson says, climbing Everest wasn't something that was preordained for him, his career looks like one that had certain milestones on the way to an inevitable crack at Everest.
Yeah, yes, you can look back at these things and trace that, but that was very definitely not in my mind. It was, as I say, it was, 1989, 1990, before I even thought about it. And because it was the act of climbing is what drove me, not any necessarily particular mountain or thing at that time. So your ambitions shifted from year to year depending on what you'd done, and therefore what the next thing was going to be. So during that period, from sort of early expeditions in the early 80s, right through, I was on probably half a dozen expeditions to various parts of the Himalaya. But they were more about going out and exploring and learning how to climb in big mountains than thinking I need to do this to be able to go and climb Everest. The Everest came later.
Like Frank Nugent said in an earlier episode, team dynamic is an important factor, and certainly for Manaslu, it wasn't quite right. I asked Dawson about this and how the team came together.
It's pretty much organic, because climbing, as I was saying, had always been, sort of organised and practiced really on an all-Ireland basis, from the very start of organised climbing back in the 30s and 40s. So it came naturally, because I was climbing with climbers from Dublin, from Kerry, from Donegal, out in the Alps, going places. So the groups were picked together on the basis of people's knowledge, experience, and drive and ambition, really. And where they came from, wasn't a factor in that. We didn't pick, Robbie, who was based in Donegal at the time, because he was based in Donegal. It was because he was a good climber and a good friend. Similar to Mike Barry from Kerry, we didn't say, well, we need somebody to represent Kerry here. Mike came because he was a good climber, a good explorer, good mountaineer, and a good friend as well. And that's the way the team came together. But by the time we got to the Everest expedition, that did become important. It became important to us that it was an all-Ireland expedition. We didn't want it to be seen as north or south or anything like that. I didn't take either a cricketer or a Union Jack to the top of Everest. It was an Irish expedition but not in any sort of national sense. It was in Ireland, as in a community of climbers from Ireland wanting to be the first people from the island to climb the mountain. And that was very much the spirit of the expedition and remained the spirit of the expedition throughout it. Yes, we deliberately invited Tony Burke and Robbie Fenlon on the expedition because they did represent that next generation of climbers coming on. But again, primarily because they were good. They were nice people, and we knew we'd get on with them, and we had climbed a lot with them. So it's this sort of and I guess that was part of the key bit of the Everest expedition, was about selecting people who were all good mountaineers, but also crucially shared the common view on how we would go about climbing it. And that's how we selected the team for Everest. And that came out of the Manaslu experience, where it was just, the selection was based purely on a bit like experience and technical ability. But that third element of willing to work together as a team for a shared view on how to climb the mountain, that became the crucial element on Everest, and was a large part of the success of the expedition, was that shared view. I mean, on any expedition, there's going to be periods of bad weather. There's going to be periods when things are going wrong, periods when people are feeling sick and feeling ill or weak. You lose confidence. You think, you picked up something you're never going to do. And it's in those periods when things are not going right, that's when that sort of cohesive team spirit becomes crucial, really, in sort of being able to blinker out all the bad things and still stick to the sort of overall aim of it. And those things are hard, so if you have all those, hard things going on, and then on the back of it, you've got divisions about style or tactics or, who's going to be doing what when, then that just leads to a sort of breakdown of that cohesive spirit. And it doesn't matter so much if you're climbing a mountain in the Alps or, a small peak, but when we were away for 3 months on the Everest expedition, and you do spend days after days just sitting around waiting for weather to clear. And, those are the dark days of any expedition, when it's just too easy just to think, this is never going to work, we'll just pack up and go home, or you fight with your neighbour in the next tent because you're frustrated about not making progress, so you pick a fight with somebody. Those are the days when the cohesiveness of the team really becomes important.
The lessons from Manaslu about team really had been learnt, but there was still a lot of organising to do, and as leader, a lot of that responsibility fell to Dawson.
So 3 months on expedition, how long are you actually trying to put it together from when you actually start thinking of logistics and team and media and so on? How long are you at that before you actually get on the plane?
Oh, well, I mean, because Manaslu and Everest were linked together, it feels now like it was pretty continuous from 1990 right through to, the expedition and beyond. So a 3-year period. On the way back from Manaslu, I actually got quite sick. I picked up hepatitis A in Kathmandu on the way back. So got back sort of early summer from Manaslu, and partly because obviously we'd failed in Manaslu and hadn't gone well, so wasn't feeling too good anyway. And I got hepatitis immediately coming back. So I was completely wiped out for that period through from summer of 1991 through to nearly a year later, in 1992. But spring of 92 I started to feel a bit better, and we'd planned to go out. I'd trying to organise the expedition because we were going in from the Tibetan side. I had to deal with the Chinese Mountaineering Association authorities, and it was really difficult. I mean, again, no easy communications, no internet. It was a dodgy fax machine to an unreliable source in Lhasa. So in early 1992, we decided, myself and my wife and a couple of friends, we'd actually fly out to Lhasa to go and negotiate directly with the Chinese authorities. So I sort of picked myself up from hepatitis and went out to Nepal, and then climbed actually a bit in Nepal, had a very enjoyable trip climbing a couple of 6,000 metre mountains, and then flew over to Tibet, Lhasa, and did the negotiations for our access and transport and everything in Tibet. And that was I suppose that was the kickstart. That was when you realise, well, this is actually going to happen. It's a real thing, this expedition. So we sat down and agreed all the transport and logistic details with the Chinese authorities. So that was a year before we went out, and it was that process of going into Lhasa and flying over Everest and down and doing all those negotiations. That's when it really kicked in that this is real. Like this is actually going to happen. But a huge amount of that rest of that year, I gave up work for a while. I was working pretty much full time on getting the expedition together.
The size of the undertaking can be seen in the need for Dawson to give up work and focus full time on the project. It was going to cost a lot of money, even for the 1990s. Where would the funding come from?
By today's standards, it probably seems quite cheap. So it was about, it worked out at about sort of £10,000 a person, so about 100,000 or so. But that was beyond the means of nearly all the climbers in the expedition. So the climbers themselves contributed only £1,000. We asked people for £1,000. And the rest of it we raised through sponsorship, through funding, and either donations in kind or things like with the media team. We had an RTE film crew with us who contributed costs. We got great sponsorship from airlines and got great sponsorship from a lot of commercial companies. And it was because it was the first Irish expedition that I suppose made it easy in some ways, because it wasn't we were doing something for the first time, but at the same time, mountaineering expeditions are not not easy things to raise sponsorship for. And quite a few sponsors said, "What happens if you go out there and all die? And we've got our name associated with a disaster, And we said, "But we're not going to die, There's that, but you don't know that, So getting sponsorship for an expedition in 1990s Ireland was tricky.
So they had the team, the money, but the question of publicity still remained. Being old enough, I can remember the expedition being quite public about what was happening. I asked Dawson about the decision to involve the media.
Yeah, we had a lot of debate about that. I mean, there would have been people who would have much preferred if we didn't have any media with us and we just went out there, and when we got back we said, yes, we climbed it, or no, we didn't. But the reality is we needed, some ways we needed the money to be able to make the expedition work, but also we were very keen, some of us were very keen to share the experience of going out there with as many people as possible, and in particular with schools, and get the message out. So Lorna Siggins from Irish Times, obviously as a journalist, came out sending back, not just writing the book at the end, but sending back a whole series of really brilliant articles on the expedition. RTE, the film crew, John Murray, leader of that, Brian Hayes, putting together a really good film at the end, but also, again, sending back dispatches and video messages. We made, both with RTE and with Downtown Radio up here, sending in regular updates. And then one of our big sponsors, Colgate, which you sort of mentioned, toothpaste, why? But they were very interested in the schools market. We developed this fantastic sort of educational poster about the expedition, which went to every primary school in Ireland. And that told the story of the history of the mountain, but also what it's like climbing at altitude. And there's sort of some bits about Tibet and Nepal as well. And that was followed up when we came back by us visiting dozens of schools around and talking about it. And Colgate as a sponsor were interested in that because they wanted to be associated with the school's element of that, So they felt even before we'd left Ireland that they'd got their money's worth, because they'd got, a Colgate branded poster going into every school, and the kids talking about mountains, and part of that message was about how do you stay healthy in the mountains, how you look after yourself. So it was a big, it was all new to us, of course, this, because we'd never been used to, raising money for sponsorship of expeditions and that public side of it. And it with quite a few people. We were nervous about it because obviously media is a dangerous thing. It can turn against you as well. And there is always the risk if something goes wrong, then, there'll be criticism for taking risks really as well. But to us, getting the story out was an important part of the expedition. Yeah. Sharing the experience. And we also, as part of that, we had 3 trekking groups of people who were ordinary, if like walkers, climbers, who wanted to go out and experience what it was like to go to base camp, up to advanced base camp if they wanted. And they had a great trek in the foothills of Nepal and then into Tibet and up to our base camp. And some of them actually then came up to advanced base camp as well. And in fact, 2 of the people on that trip went on to climb Everest themselves. Hannah Shields, who was Sod, and Terence Banjo Bannon from Uri. Both them came back and got inspired by that trip and then came back and it was the first one from Northern Ireland to climb Everest. And Banjo a few years later as well.
Hannah Shields and Terence Banjo Bannon are 2 people I hope you will hear from in future episodes of the podcast. So the scene is almost set for the expedition. I asked Dawson some final questions about the run-up to departure, how he is feeling, and how his family are feeling as this great adventure is at last ready to go.
Oh, it was a really busy time, and it's a sort of balance of like trying to still stay fit and active and get out in the mountains and be climbing, but at the same time being sort of wrapped up in the whole logistics of it all. So we had to. We most of our specialist food for on the mountain we brought with us. A lot of it was donated to us, and we had to pack that all up. And it was all packed up in sort of predetermined sections, so it was easy to manage when we're out there. So you had a bag which was 2 persons' food for 2 days, sort of thing, all pre-packed. So all our high mountain food was all came out with us on the approach and as we went in. And to a certain extent at base camp we were using local food, so that was just bought, made out there. But the packing was a huge element of that. There was, massive amount of boxes and barrels all packaged to go out. So that exercise took a lot of time, a lot of effort. Not all of it was there freighted out before we left, so that all had to be ready a month or so before we left the country. So getting all that ready became this sort of absorbent sort of logistical effort, really, and took a huge amount of effort getting that out. And at the same time, you were trying to get out in the mountains and be fit and healthy and all the rest of it. So big effort to get everything out. But it's effort that everybody, we split up the tasks amongst the team. Some of the team looked after the food, some of the radio equipment, some of the climbing equipment. It was a huge collective effort to get everything ready. Really, I mean, the best training I've always, reckon the best training for climbing is climbing, just getting out there. The last official training that we had is we all went to Scotland for a week or 10 days or so in wintertime and climbing on Ben Nevis. And we hit lucky with the weather and we got really good snow and ice conditions and we were all climbing up and did some, good routes on the north side of Ben Nevis. And you might think, well, that's all, climbing for a day in Scotland, what's that got to do with climbing on Everest? But climbing in Scotland in wintertime can be really tough, can be really resilient. Short days, bad weather, very variable conditions. And you have to move fast, you have to, taking on quite technical routes. And it's the act of doing the climbing, I guess, is the important bit, whether it's in north face of Ben Nevis in wintertime or, north side of Everest in the spring. But importantly, it was also a chance for us all, because we were all spread around the country, and a chance for us to get together and climb together and enjoy being out in the mountains together, which was a crucial part of the expedition anyway, and to be able to do that. So our last official training trip was to Scotland, which back in March, February, just a month or so before we actually left. You're just dying to get away, really. I mean, elated, really. I thought, this is it. Everything you've been, trying to put in place for a couple of years, this stage. And there's obviously a bit of trepidation, and this is, you're heading off. But expeditions happen over a period of time. We deliberately were going in to start with in Kathmandu in the Nepalese side. We then went on a trek in the Langtang to get acclimatized. There'd been a previous Irish expedition to Changsey in the north side of Everest in 1987, and they'd gone straight from Nepal into base camp, and a lot of them had got very sick from altitude sickness early on, because in Tibet you go straight up to high altitude. There's no walking. You drive up to high altitude. So we deliberately spent 10 days in Nepal trekking up to about 5,000 meters or so, just to get acclimatized. And so that was a really nice period where you've all the busyness of everything getting ready. Suddenly you're away. But we then had 10 days of fairly slowly walking, gradually climbing up to, sort of the middle height of mountains. And really the only purpose of that trip was to let your body acclimatize. So, there's no pressure of climbing, no pressure of, media performances or talking to sponsors or anything like that. It was just a nice settling in period. So we then didn't go on the buses and trucks over the high passes and into Tibet. We were acclimatized to the base camp height before we got there. And that meant that as soon as we got there, we were able to start into the business of getting ready to climb the mountain. I guess my family, so I was married, this is Margaret. She's a climber as well. She understood climbing. She came out at the end of the expedition. She'd been climbing with me in Nepal the year before. We climbed a couple of 6,000 metre peaks together. So Margaret understood and understands mountaineering, understands the drive. And a lot of the partners of the climbers were like that as well. They understood that. But it's always a difficult time when you're going off for 2 or 3 months at a time, with an unknown outcome and unknown what you're going to do. But it was in a spirit of enthusiasm and recognition that everybody had trained for this and was ready for it, and it was a big collective venture. So we went with, as far as I know from everybody, we went with the support of our families, and went with that encouragement behind us.
I think it's fair to say that Dawson, Frank and their team, Dermot Summers, Robbie Fenlon, Mike Barry, Richard O'Neill Dean, Mick Murphy and Tony Burke had the support of everyone in Ireland, north and south. Join us next week to hear Dawson describe a momentous moment in Irish climbing and mountaineering history. If you are enjoying the podcast so far, please like and subscribe and tell others about us. And remember, stay safe and stay cool.